Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Poems and Paintings. Today's day 152, and we're continuing with this verbs of position topic now for the second day. And remember, we're going kind of bit by bit here through the three sets of infinitives. Now, yesterday we learned the four infinitives, right? Not pairs, but just single infinitives for describing being in a position. Remember, those are all imperfective because they describe this state, this ongoing state, right? So all imperfective and only one infinitive. Today we're learning the four new ways to talk about assuming a position or moving into a position. So again, try to visualize this idea of motion, right? It's not that you're in a chair, for example, but you're moving onto the chair. You're moving into a position. So we should be thinking of sort of kuda, a kind of kuda idea. And we'll see that today's verbs we are going to get aspectual pairs, right? But you think about it, you can be in the process of assuming a sitting position, or you can simply assume it perfectively, right? For example, he was assuming a sitting position, he was getting into a chair, or he simply got into a chair, he sat down, we'd say in English. Okay, before we get to that, let's just add another verb that's very useful. It's basically just a prefix form of one we learned yesterday, right? Висеть. Висеть means to be in a hanging position, and today's verb зависеть means something like to be hanging from, right? To be hanging from, that is to depend, right? You may never have thought about this, but maybe if you studied French or something, you did. But the English verb depend means in French dépendre, right? Literally means to be hanging, right? To pendre means to hang, and de means from, right? So to depend means literally to be hanging from something. So as a chance would have it, the Russian idiom is exactly the same, right? If we say something is hanging from something else, it means it depends on it. Okay, so basically that's just the new verb here is зависеть от, right? We say something is hanging from something plus the genitive. Okay, so let's just look at a few examples. Он думает, что счастье зависит от зарплаты, right? He, fool that he is, thinks that happiness depends on salary. Of course, maybe it does to an extent, I don't know. But anyway, look at the grammar. Счастье, happiness, зависит, it depends on. Now, again, think of the literal meaning. It can be helpful. It hangs from salary, right? It's dependent or literally hanging from salary. Счастье не зависит от того, сколько ты зарабатываешь. Okay, here's a little to construction, right? A bit more complicated. Happiness doesn't depend on how much you earn, right? And again, as we've seen this before, we're using a to sort of mark the case, in this case, the genitive. And then then we have that followed by a full clause here opening with a question word, right? So another example. Много будет зависеть от этих переговоров. A lot will depend on these negotiations there in the future tense. Все зависит от того, успеем ли мы на этот поезд. Okay, here again is a to, kind of a placeholder, showing the genitive case, and it's setting up this just a subordinate clause and a verb, basically, right? Everything depends on, actually, it's kind of a question clause. I didn't really think about it. Li, right? It's a li clause, right? So everything depends on whether or not we catch this train. If we look at today's painting, it's called неравный брак, meaning an unequal marriage, right? Obviously, a young girl is marrying this older man for whatever reason, right? Probably his money, and she's being married off. Obviously, not a very ideal situation for her, needless to say. Okay, so what could a little caption we could supply to this painting might read: "Так много зависит от брака," right? So much depends on marriage, right? On whom you marry and so forth. Можно сказать, что в XIX веке еще больше зависело, чем сегодня. Okay, one can say that in the 19th century, even more depended on marriage, that is, even more depended on marriage than it does today. Так как развестись было трудно тогда, right? Because it was hard to get divorced back then, especially for a woman, right? So as in so many other things, there was this gender imbalance, right? And so this question of getting married and all this stuff, you can think of a lot of examples in Russian literature, by the way, if you've read this or that. One nice story, by the way, by Chekhov that's in my reader is called Anna na Sheye, where you had this kind of imbalance, right, where a woman kind of marries under a certain state of duress. And then in that one, it's quite surprising because she totally turns the tables on her husband. So anyway, if I won't spoil the story, but there's a pretty dramatic reversal there. It's quite amusing. Anyway, у этой девушки, yeah, so getting divorced was difficult, right? У этой девушки нет приданого. This girl doesn't have a dowry. Значит, ее выдали за старого человека против ее воли, right? Presumably, if she had a large dowry, she might have attracted a more, an ideal suitor or whatever. But for whatever reason, again, I'm just kind of speculating. She's being, it seems, married off against her will, против ее воли. Теперь она будет полностью зависеть от мужа. Now she will be completely dependent on her husband. Ужас, right? Okay, so that's terrible. Okay, right. So again, now if you read, for example, Chekhov's story, you see that things aren't quite as simple as I'm making them sound. But again, the point kind of this painting is, she's kind of stuck here in a marriage she obviously doesn't have any desire to be in, and that's obviously not a very happy situation. Okay, anyway, let's look at one more thing quickly. Another way to say it depends, or something depends, and think about this, we say this a lot. Well, it depends. It depends on this or that. Well, you can, as we've seen, use this verb зависеть, which is a little formal, sort of. Or you can say смотря plus a question word. This means literally looking, right? That's a verbal adverb. So looking how much things cost or something like this, right? So are you going to Russia? Well, looking at how much the tickets cost or something like this. That's kind of the literal unpacking of that phrase. So this is quite a bit simpler and more colloquial. You hear this quite a bit. For example, ты идешь с нами? Are you going with us? Are you coming with us? Смотря куда вы идете, right? Well, it depends on to where you're going, right? Where are you going to? Гостиницы там дорого стоят, right? Are the hotels there expensive? Now, by the way, note that that's not the verb стоять, to be in a standing position, but the verb стоить, which means to cost, right? So do the hotels there cost expensively, right? Or do they cost a lot? Ну, смотря где находится, right? It depends on where they're located, right? Ты хочешь газету? Would you like a newspaper? Смотря какую? Well, it depends on what kind of a newspaper it is, right? Okay, so just a few very simple constructions there. Let's translate a few sentences using this verb зависеть от plus the genitive. The price depends on the quality. Цена зависит от качества. Right, so pretty simple construction. Number two, the economic situation will depend, future, on the price of oil. Oil is neft in Russian. That's a feminine e-noun that I believe was borrowed via Turkish. It entered Russian via Turkish from Arabic. Okay, so экономическая ситуация. And by the way, if you didn't know that, we're going to spend quite a bit of time later in this book talking, among other things, about how Russian borrows words. This is one of these phrases, экономическая ситуация, that even if you've never heard those words in your life, you can basically predict those Russian words just based off the English and or French models. Again, we'll practice that a bit, and once you get the hang of that, it's quite easy. And as I mentioned before, you'll be amazed how many of these borrowed words there are in Russian that are just, very predictable equivalents of some word in English or French, or Latin or Greek, originally for that matter. Okay, anyway, экономическая ситуация будет зависеть от цены на нефть. Right, that's kind of the idiom, the price of oil, right? Of course, the Russian economy has a lot to do with the prices of these commodities like oil and gas and whatever. Okay, 3, our plans will depend on the weather. Okay, another future tense thing. Наши планы будут зависеть от погоды, right? They will depend. Они будут зависеть от погоды. 4, everything depends on what they will say tomorrow. Все зависит. Okay, now we've got this verb, right, on what they will say tomorrow. We've got this more complicated construction, so we're going to throw in a того. Все зависит от того, что они скажут завтра. Right? 5, he doesn't want to depend on his parents. Он не хочет зависеть от родителей. Okay, so those are pretty simple examples there. Okay, now let's get to the meat of today's lesson, right? Assuming a position. Okay, now first of all, let's review the table here, right? We've now filled in two of the three columns. And note that yesterday's verbs to be in a position, those were где. We should think of those as где ideas, right? But today we're moving into the position, so that's a куда. So always try to visualize that idea of motion into a position. And here we get pairs, right? So let's just look over the pairs. Становиться, стать means to, again, if we unpack that, to assume a standing position. That verb can also mean a couple of other things. It can mean to become something, and it can also mean to begin to do something. You might want to pencil that in there in the book. So if you're reading literature and you see, or whatever, and you see this verb, it could mean three fairly different things, but its most basic meaning is to assume a standing position. And then by extension, figuratively, it came to mean to become or to begin to do something. Okay, anyway, right now note that становиться has the reflexive particle, стать doesn't. That's very unusual, but this is kind of an unusual verb. Okay, to assume a lying position is ложиться, лечь. Again, we had the ся for the imperfective, but not for the second one. And to assume a sitting position is садиться, сесть. Okay, look at лечь and сесть. Those are two ultimately irregular verbs, really. Although лечь is acting more or less like a ge verb, the thing that's unpredictable is this ля, right? The ya vowel that pops up. Similarly with сесть, right? It's basically a de obstruent, and but the ся, right? The ya, the appearance of that vowel is unpredictable. Okay, so review those, right? Лягу, ляжешь, ляжет, ляжем, ляжете, лягут, right? We're back to ge in the third plural. And then the verb for sitting, right? Again, this would mean I will assume a sitting position. Я сяду, сядешь, сядет, сядем, сядете, сядут. Finally, to assume a hanging position, just sort of spontaneously, the pair there is повисать, повиснуть. And I've given that here, and actually we'll see an example of it here in a moment, but that's very unusual, right? Just something spontaneously assumes a hanging position. Right now, again, note that doesn't mean that it's being hung somewhere. It means that it is itself assuming a position. Okay, so that's very unusual, but it does crop up now and then, and when it does, it's often extremely descriptive, and again, we'll see an example in a moment. But for practical purposes, you could basically just ignore that. I mean, really. Okay, one little verb with a similar meaning to assume a hanging position, is зависать, зависнуть. That one you might want to learn because it's actually used by Russians for when something like a computer freezes, right? The idea is that it gets hung up, I guess you could say, right? So if you say computer висит, meaning it is hanging, that means that it's frozen. Or the disappearing new verb, right? Зависнуть, you could say computer завис, that means that it's frozen. It's assumed a hanging position. It's gotten hung up or something, you could say. Okay, now, by the way, one other little bit of review. Another verb that means more specifically to stand up, right, meaning to rise. That's вставать, встать. Okay, so that's quite a bit more common than this more basic verb становиться, стать, which again, the meaning of that is very clear if we unpack it. It means to assume a standing position, not necessarily to stand up, right? So we'll see examples of that in a moment. But again, there in the book, you've got a bit of review just of some other verbs you may know with similar meanings. Okay, take one more look at the conjugation of these of three of these perfective verbs because they're quite unusual. So лечь and сесть are weird. We've already seen. Стать, not really that weird, but it's an in verb. And so there are the forms just in case you need to review that. Now look in the past tense and we see that лечь is very unusual. Right. Although, again, it really works like in other ge obstruents, like, for example, мочь, right? If you think about мочь, могу, можешь, могут, and then in the past tense, мог, могла, могли, etc. Similarly here, лег, meaning he assumed a lying position, right? Perfective, bam. Okay, now he's lying down. He assumed a lying position. Легла, легло, etc. Сел would mean he assumed a sitting position, right? Or as we'd say normally in English, he sat down. Ciela, ciela, etc. Okay, so let's just supply a few of these verbs. Let's first do future tense, right? And we're focusing on these ones that are a bit tricky. Let's lie down to sleep. Let's go to bed. Давайте ляжем спать. Давайте ляжем спать. Remember, with those verbs, we use with давай expressions, we use future tense мы forms of the verb. Okay, let's say we're all going to bed. Okay, so the dog will lie down on the floor. It will assume a lying position on the floor, and the cat will assume a lying position on the easy chair. Пес future tense, ляжет на пол, а кошка ляжет на кресло. Okay, what about past tense? The student went to bed. Literally, he lay down to sleep. Студент лег спать. Okay, the female student did the same. Студентка легла спать. Their friends also did the same. Их друзья, plural, тоже легли спать. Легли спать. Okay, сесть, future tense. Okay, look at this. To where will the guests assume a sitting position? Okay, so again, we unpack that. Maybe that helps a little bit. So we don't say where. We don't say где они сядут. But although you could say that, there's more you could say about this. But almost always that would be куда. That would be куда in Russian. So куда сядут гости? Куда сядут гости? Well, let grandma sit near the window and we'll sit near the wall. Пусть бабушка сядет у окна, let her assume the sitting position near the window, а мы сядем у стены, and we'll sit near the wall. By the way, у here isn't clearly a куда expression, right? That's just because here we're talking about proximity. We're not getting into or onto something, right? So again, with some of these prepositions, we won't necessarily have a distinction between где versus куда. Okay, past tense. Everyone literally sat onto transport. Okay, so when you're boarding transportation, you sit onto it. Все, past tense, сели на транспорт. Okay, my brother or our brother or whatever, literally sat onto the subway and sister sat onto the bus. Брат сел на метро, а сестра села на автобус. Okay, look there it's clearly куда, right? На транспорт, на метро, на автобус with the accusative, those are куда expressions. And of course, that's a very common use for these sitting verbs in Russian, right? To literally sit onto transport, to board transport. Stать, why don't I... Okay, look at this as a good example. Why don't I assume a standing position into line? Okay, so look at how, again, helpful, I think, at least for beginners, that is to unpack that. Right? Давайте я стану в очередь за билетами, а вы станете в очередь в туалет. Okay, so again, we're standing into the line. Okay, шесть, past tense. Мы стали в очередь за билетами, а наш друг стал в очередь в клуб. So again, literally, we stood into line for tickets while our friend stood into the line into the club, right? Let's see. Here's a painting, Christos Pustinia, famous painting in the Tretyakovka, right? The Tretyakovskaya Galleria in Moscow by Kramskoy. And again, just a little caption. Christos сел на камень. Christ has sat, he's assumed a sitting position onto a rock. Right? So in English, I guess we just say he sat on a rock, he sat down on a rock. But we have to be careful in Russian. Okay, now we can describe the position he's in. Now that he's assumed a sitting position, он сидит в пустыне. He's sitting in the desert, in the wilderness. Здесь в пустыне его будет искушать черт. Here in the wilderness, in the desert, the devil will tempt him, right? So this is before the temptation. By the way, those temptations, you talk about a major scene in Russian literature, the reimagining of these temptations, the three temptations of Christ by the Grand Inquisitor and the brothers Karamazov. That's just an incredible scene. So be sure and check that out if you've never read it. And I'm not sure I've talked about the brothers Karamazov here, but that's my favorite novel of all time. I love that novel. It's my favorite one. So If you haven't read it, I highly advise you to try it. By the way, we're going to read Crime and Punishment, quite a bit of it later in this course. And as good as it is, it's really, I think, to me at least, astounding how much more complex and more, just more deep, I would say, Brothers Karamazov is than I mean, by comparison, it makes Crime and Punishment look rather simplistic, and that's really saying something. Okay, so anyway, let's see. Это событие называется искушением Христа. This event is called, and then we get instrumental, the temptation of Christ. Okay, let's look at a few examples with, again, kuda expressions with these verbs. Now, remember, these kuda expressions could be used both with verbs of position or with verbs of motion, right? So we should be pretty comfortable with these by now. Let's just look at a few examples. Он вбежал в свою комнату. He ran into his room, куда, accusative, right? И лег на диван. And he lay down onto the sofa, so to speak. Okay, so one motion verb, one verb of position, both taking a куда expression. Она вошла в парк и села на зеленую скамейку. She walked into the park, куда, and sat down onto, quote-unquote, a green bench. На зеленую скамейку. By the way, now we could say, она сидит на зеленой скамейке, right? Then we'd be back to, she's in a position on, где, on a green bench. Мы стали в длинную очередь в ночной клуб. Again, unpacking that literally, we assumed a standing position into a long line into the nightclub. Okay, so two kuda expressions there. Let's see. One note, by the way, quickly, is that Russians will also sometimes use vstать, that other verb we just reviewed, to mean, as we know, means to get up. They'll often use that for this idea of getting into a line. You can use either. Okay, here's a quick idiom. We've seen this already, I think, or maybe we've glimpsed it here or there. In Russian, you don't sit at a table; you sit behind a table, right? So that's just a little idiom. Okay, so to assume a sitting position behind the table is садиться сесть за стол, right? So за стол, note that that's accusative, right? You're moving into that position behind the table. Now compare that with сидеть за столом. That means to be in a sitting position behind the table with the instrumental, right? That's a где expression. And finally, how do you get up from the table? Well, in Russian, you get up, again, using вставать, встать, right? That rising idea, from behind the table. That's an откуда expression, right? Вставать or встать из-за стола. Okay, so those are fairly useful. So if we look at a painting, right, Krestyansky is bia in a peasant, in izba is a traditional wooden, peasant hut. We could supply a little caption. Krestyansky семья села за стол попить чай. A peasant family has sat behind the table, literally, to have a bit of tea. Весело сидеть вместе за столом и отдыхать, right? It's nice to to be sitting together behind the table and to relax. Но скоро придется встать из-за стола и вернуться на работу. But soon it will be necessary to rise from behind the table and return to work. Okay, let's do a few more verbs of position with kuda expressions. Okay, now watch the tense. He came home, he lay down, he assumed a lying position onto the sofa and turned on the TV. Он пришел домой, лег на диван, right, куда, и включил телевизор. Number 2, the cat approached him, walked up to him, and assumed a lying position, past tense, onto the pillow at his feet. Кошка подошла к нему и легла на подушку, right, куда, у его ног, at his feet. 3, at what time do you usually lie down to go to bed, right? Or lie down to sleep, literally. Во сколько вы обычно ложитесь спать? What time did you do this yesterday? А во сколько вчера легли, right? If we keep the вы, легли. Number 4, the child often assumes a sitting position right onto the floor and plays with the cat. So it sits right smack dab in the middle of the floor. and plays with the cat. Ребенок часто садится прямо на пол or на пол и играет с кошкой and plays with the cat. 5. The cat walked up to the child and assumed a sitting position, keeping past tense, and we have a sequence here. So assumed a sitting position onto its knees. Okay, so the cat is getting in the child's lap, and we have a kind of tricky little thing here. So кошка подошла к ребенку и села к нему. So the idea is something like toward the child, and now we get more specifically onto the knees, meaning onto the child's lap. На колени. Okay, number 6, assuming a standing position. Wait, why don't I assume a standing position onto the chair in order to take down the painting or the picture from the wall? Подожди, давай я стану на стул, right, accusative, куда, чтобы снять картину со стены. Okay, now we could, use где and куда expressions. Let's just look at 2 more examples. Кошка легла на пол, or на пол, right? So that's the куда, right? Assuming the position. And now we can say она лежит на полу. Now it is in a lying position on the floor. Где. Футболист сел на скамейку запасных. So the soccer player sat down onto the bench of reserve players, right? So he's a bench warmer. Он часто там сидит. He often sits there. Okay, so he's warming the bench all the time. He is often in a sitting position. Там, right? Meaning на скамейке запасных. Okay, so let's do a couple of combinations here. Again, first we're getting into the position, and then we're describing being in the position. So we got into the line. Okay, we've got to be careful. In Russian, that's going to be we assumed a standing position into the line. That would be мы стали в очередь час назад. Now we're still in a standing position in the line. Мы еще или мы до сих пор стоим в очереди. Number 2, I'm lying in bed and reading. Okay, that's in the position. Я лежу в постели и читаю. Я лежу в постели и читаю. I get in bed early. Okay, that's present tense, right? Multiple or habitual action, so that's going to be imperfective. Я ложусь спать рано, чтобы почитать перед сном. Right? To read a bit, почитать перед сном, right before going to sleep. Перед plus the instrumental. Okay, number 3, my friends and I sat onto the bus, literally. Мы с друзьями, right? Remember that little idiom, right? My friends and I. In Russian, it's going to be мы с друзьями сели на автобус. We assumed a sitting position onto the bus. Now we're in a sitting position in the bus and looking out the window. Or in Russian, you say you're looking into the window. Okay, so теперь мы сидим на автобусе и смотрим в окно. Number 4, let's sit at that table near the window. Okay, again, we're saying let's assume a sitting position at that table near the window. So we have to be very careful. Давайте сядем за стол, or за тот стол, у окна, right next to the window. Okay, now we could say we're sitting so well, literally. That's a fairly common little expression meaning, hey, good times, right? We're having good times at the table here. Мы так хорошо сидим. Мы хорошо сидим, right? We're sitting well, literally. We are in a sitting position well. Okay, I mentioned earlier that this verb, повисать, повиснуть, meaning to spontaneously assume a hanging position is rather rare. And really, at this stage especially, you can basically just forget about it. But believe it or not, we've already seen a very, very descriptive, really masterful use of it by Pushkin, right? So actually, we can take a couple of passages from Medny Всадник that we can now hopefully understand a little bit better now that we've covered these motion verbs. So the first one, if you may remember, right, very early in the poem, Peter the Great says, «Природой здесь нам суждено в Европу прорубить окно, ногою твердой стать приморье». Okay, so by nature here, for us, it has been adjudged or ordained, to prorubить окно, to chop through, to cut through a window into Europe or onto Europe. There's a куда phrase, в Европу, right? The window onto Europe, as it's usually put in English. Ногою твердой стать приморье. Okay, let's unpack that, and again, we can get a very clear idea of what the Russian literally means. Nature has ordained for us, A, to open a window onto Europe, and two, to stать приморье, to assume a standing position near the sea or at the seashore with a firm foot, right? So it's the idea of something like gaining a firm foothold. Russia is now establishing its foothold near the sea, right? And if you remember, the idea is to challenge Swedish supremacy up there in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic area, right? So again, if we can unpack that, and we get a very clear sense of what the Russian means there. And again, it's kind of hard to translate that. It's actually fairly easy to unpack, but again, capturing that meaning in good colloquial English is a bit of a challenge. I'm not really sure what the quote unquote right answer is to that. To establish ourselves, to establish a position. Now, of course, that doesn't sound very poetic. So anyway, there are all sorts of issues here in trying to translate that into good poetic sounding English. Okay, I think even more interestingly, remember that phrase, when we were reading it, I think I hopefully emphasized it, Прошло 100 лет юный град, blah, 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 right? So 100 years passed and the young city, blah, blah, blah. And then he starts going on to talk about all the beautiful buildings and bridges and et cetera. And what's so important there is the subtext, right? That after Peter says, let's found a city here near the city in the swamp, near the Gulf of Finland in these swamps. In the text, in Pushkin's text, it's as if the city just springs out of nowhere. Right now, of course, we know that it's built basically by enslaved people, right? Many of whom died in the process, right? So there's this kind of dark story here that's being glazed over. And here's another way in which Pushkin suggests as much, using very few words, right? В гранит оделась Neva. The Neva River was clothed in granite. Okay, there we have a passive construction. We could say that it clothed itself, or it was closed. But either way we understand that, the question is, well, who clothed it in granite, right? That's a back-breaking process, right? To put granite embankments along not only the Neva River, but all of the canals and all the other rivers up there. Okay, so again, you see how he's kind of artfully obscuring the fact that people, basically slaves, did this, right? And okay, so a lot of things left unsaid here. Now he says, "Mosty pavisli nad vadami." Okay, how can we unpack that? Literally, bridges assumed a hanging position above the waters spontaneously, right? So you see how again, if we unpack that, the meaning is very clear. Bridges are the subject of this verb, and it's as if they just magically, spontaneously appeared assumed a hanging position above the waters, right? There's no mention whatsoever of anyone who put them there or built them or did all of this back-breaking work. Okay, and finally, темно зелеными садами ее покрылись острова. Her islands, meaning that Neva's islands, were covered by dark green gardens. Okay, so watch for that verb. I encountered another good use of it somewhere just lately. I can't remember where it was, but here, that's the best example I can think of it there with Pushkin. Okay, so anyway, that's enough for today. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи.